Thank you very much, dear Chair. Many thanks to organizers for the invitation. First of all, I have to apologize for two things because I will have to take my leave quite soon since it's Sunday and day off here, and they have a further responsibility to my kids. And second, I'm afraid my speech will emerge somewhat from the thematic section. Actually, I'm a big fan of the history of maritime rivalry and military conflict, but today I will try to play devil's advocate because I'm not sure that we have anything like real rivalry between great powers in the Indo-Pacific. I think that it's a classic example of applying a familiar formula to a fundamentally different phenomenon, and it can lead to dangerous post-sledging. I'm not a supporter of political realism, I'm rather a constructivist, and I will try to consider the issue from this point of view. So some theory for the beginning. I would like to remind that the very idea of rivalry between nations is relatively new and is associated with the late modern era. Before that, so it was kings and rulers who competed, not nations as powers. And this is important because often the desired outcome of this rivalry was the ruler. So for the ruler was the change of comparative status, not the abstract balance of power. And in addition to status, so territorial acquisitions, of course, were important because in those days it was direct taxation that helped fill the treasury. And plus, the larger the population you have, the larger the pool of recruits. And this is important because, so due to jour per gros bataillon. As mercantilism spread, trading rights also began to matter, but for a long time they remained quite secondary. After monarchies were replaced by republics and democracies in the late modern period, we found ourselves in quite strange situation because, so if the question of status was clear, what we spoke when we spoke of ruler and his rights, then what does the status of the democratic nation mean? What determines it, and what does the status practically give in general? So the idea that the goal of conflict is territorial expansion has changed as well because direct taxation of the population is no longer the only means of replenishing the treasury, and the quality and skills of populations, the state's place in the production value chains, and so monetary policy are more important than the pure number of people. And moreover, the acquisition of new territories is now considered as negative sign and is avoided unless it concerns important strategic points. So finally, trade rights are not so important now either because the era of mercantilism is gone. The current economy is mainly free trader economy, in fact. And despite all borders and barriers, and a typical example is that FDI is considered an important driver of economic development. And this is a huge difference compared to the era of rivalry of past centuries. And what it means to practice? What do we mean when we talk about rivalry between powers? So in pre-imperialist times, it was about status. Now, status in the sense it existed then gives nothing. In the times of imperialism, rivalry meant a fight for markets. The country that won that rivalry could export its goods to the markets of third countries and tie the economy to its own. And now we live in the era of free trade, and so do businesses of great countries compete in the region? For the most part, no. Because small and medium businesses do not compete at all, and big businesses sometimes compete, but in general, there is a larger division of spheres of interest. For example, Chinese companies are active in building cheap infrastructure. Japanese companies focus on high quality infrastructure. Indian companies are building digital infrastructure, but in general, their projects are concentrated mainly in spheres of finance and light industry. Rather, from my point of view, of course, we are witnessing a symbiosis between the businesses of great power. Because where Chinese corporations are laying down infrastructure, Indian small and medium enterprises are emerging. And we can analyze, for example, East African crude oil pipeline, EACOP. In its construction, Chinese, European, Australian companies were involved for varying degrees. In fact, the economic rivalry between the great powers in the region now means rivalry for individual projects, and China is clearly winning in this, since the Chinese economy is now interested in exporting capital. Often this export is perceived as state-directed, as part of grand design, and we can see this is often, from our point of view here in Russia, it's a chaotic process that's largely inspired from below, because Chinese firms are trying to move capital abroad and seek to enlist the support of the state. They usually use the rhetoric as a Belt and Road initiative and something like that. It's understandable and close to authorities. And as a result, Chinese economic projects are perceived from the outside as in a quite distorted way, because their successes are obvious, but their failures are not visible. And so classic example is the case of Hambantota port, because we already know that the lion's share of loans that the Rajapaksa's government used to build Hambantota were not Chinese. So we know that the initiative to build a port in this area was Rajapaksa's own idea and was caused by internal reasons because he wanted to improve the living conditions of his hometown. We know that the Chinese ended up leasing Hambantota for a small sum because the port was not really needed in the Colombo context. In fact, even the United States and China are hardly economic rivals in the true sense of the word, because until recently the economies were so closely linked that we saw there was talk about G2 or Chimerica format. And now this idea had been shelved, of course, but despite all the loud phrases about decoupling, American companies are still operating in China and are not in any hurry to move production to other countries. In fact, we are witnessing a continuing growth and interdependence between all great powers in the region, albeit in different forms, of course. And this interdependence cannot be shaken by any political issues. And after the conflict in Ukraine began, for example, European countries and the United States imposed sanctions on Russia, stopping buying oil from it directly. But this led only to one result, because they continue to buy oil from Russia only through laundromats. And their governments pretend that Russian undemocratic oil becomes democratic after refining in Indian democratic refineries, or after adding a drop of Saudi democratic oil. So during the Cold War, a great power rivalry was fueled by ideological difference. Now there is no particular ideological difference because, yeah, Chinese regime is special. In the West, it's called authoritarian, totalitarian. In China itself, it's called a people's democracy. And in any case, it doesn't resemble the Westminster system, but China is not trying to export it as the Soviet Union tried to do. In China and in the United States and in India, in Japan and Russia, the economy is essentially capitalist, with varying degrees of paternalism. So I cannot see any ideological rivalry in the region. And in fact, the entire discourse of great power rivalry is supported by the governments, so the political military elites and expert community that serves them, and the media, of course. Of course, by urbanized middle class, which is always more interested in foreign policy issues than any other part of society. In fact, it's within the framework of perception and transmission of the views of these social groups, so this discourse of great power rivalry exists. And this discourse is different in each country, because in the United States, there is a growing idea of inevitable clash with China, and mentally, this concept completely repeats the scenario of Japanese attack in the beginning of Second World War. It's implied that China will attack either the United States or Japan, of any United States allies, and the United States will intervene or win, of course. And this idea is actively sought after by the American middle class, is supported by the writers, by the media, by the authors of coffee table books. Well, every year a bunch of paperbacks editions are published in which the future war is described. For intellectuals, there is another product, for example, discussions about the Thucydides trap and all that. In fact, so Western military experts with a magnifying glass are looking for any signs of growth of Chinese naval power and are trying to find among Chinese thinkers a Chinese Mechan who could inspire the emergence of Chinese Yamamoto in a way familiar to Western mind. But in China, things are viewed very differently because no one is going to repeat the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor or attacks, or the United States Navy, because the United States Navy is significantly superior in the combat capabilities to Chinese Navy. In essence, the Chinese approach boils down to defending its territorial claims as much as possible, nine-dash line, disputed talents, and so on. Striving to do business in the entire region and numerous complaints about United States attempts to hinder Chinese growth. It's not a fact that the situation will not change, of course, because Chinese are actively absorbing the Western military theory. So I was surprised when I visited Shanghai last year. So there are a lot of Western military theory books translated into into Chinese. So it's in fact dozens of them. So they are sold everywhere, and there is a risk that sooner or later this will affect the situation, affect the Chinese minds. But for now, the maximum Chinese military activity is local exercises and single submarine trips to the Indian Ocean, and one little base in Djibouti, of course. And finally, India. So there is the idea of Chinese string of pearls, Chinese plans to strangle India in the possible conflict. Obviously, this is, from my point of view, is absolutely hypothetical scenario, since in order for China to achieve any success in the fight against India in the Indian Ocean, it needs to transfer its entire navy there, which will also have to be supplied through the Straits of Malacca. And there are no guarantees of victory, since India has coastal-based missile complexes, base aviations, other means. In fact, China now has just one base in Indian Ocean, in Djibouti, and this base cannot be compared with the American base in Diego Garcia, either in size or in equipment. So it's impossible to conduct full-fledged operations based on, well, this point, which means that the Chinese threat to the Indian Ocean is, I can repeat it, is hypothetical. India is actively building the navy and strengthening the Andaman position. In fact, in a sense, this is something like the risk theory anti strategy, with only one difference, but very prominent difference, because India, not China, is an advantageous strategic position. At the same time, the Indian authorities are extremely sober in their assessment of the situation and understand that they have lived side by side with China for several thousand years. And despite all problems, well, they will continue to do so. So the American approach to the problem is alien to India. And so the elites of one great power are afraid for position of this, so its position, the elites of the second are concerned with the local problems, the elites of the third so use imaginary construct to solve these problems. And all this look like a situation in which the outbreak of conflict is not very likely from my point of view, but this is not a reason to calm down, because the decision to start a conflict is made not by businessmen, but the political and military elites. And the more there is talk about that the rivalry can escalate into war, the greater likelihood to war. And the more unilateral formats are created to contain in China, the greater the likelihood of conflict, because it becomes more difficult to control the actions of aggressive junior commanders who want to prove themselves and are confident that the big daddy will step in for them if necessary. The problem of actions of the ground is generally one of the most acute, so they have repeatedly led to unwanted conflict and incidents throughout history. And I can remind the most recent example in Galvan Valley, where the actions of local Chinese border commander led to bloody clash, and in fact led to the well, problems in bilateral relations between India and China for 5 years. This could easily happen with any European, Australian, any other ship. In this respect, people are the same, and junior and mid-level officers are the same to a greater extent. So, what about Russia? It's a great power, a nuclear power, of course, but although Russia generally recognized as a great power, it's a not great power in the Pacific, because Russia has no industrial base in the region, no shipbuilding base, has great population deficit. Military, it's very weak in the region. The Pacific Fleet, for example, excluding strategic nuclear submarines, is inferior even to the Japanese self-defense forces. And at the same time, Russia, under sanctions, is now turning to the east, so it's most actively interested in the region, being calm and business-like, and the rivalry between the great powers being minimized. Thank you.